All right, welcome folks. It is noon on May 4th. May the 4th be with you, as they say. And we are here for our next New York cannabis legalization workshop hosted by HempLab. As you can see, I'm wearing my favorite shirt of the week. Happy to be here with my colleague and board member, Jason Klimek. We will also be joined by founder and executive director of NORML, Mary Kruger. And yeah, today we're picking up where we left off last week, somewhere in the middle of the Office of Cannabis Management. More to that soon. But before diving in, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to our sponsoring member, Harris Beach Law Firm. Literally been with us from the start, and we wouldn't be here without y'all. So thank you so much. Also, big shout out to our founding business members, Boyle & Code, Canamill, NYCGPA, Singer Farms, Forefathers Innovation, Tracy Jong Law Firm, Dawson Law Firm, and Closed Loop Systems. Also been with us from the start, and just really appreciate y'all. Got a few new business members in 2021, CBRE, Beacon Stiff, Apple Orchards, EFPR Group, and Hellendale. Got a plethora of individual members. We are a member-supported organization. Y'all's contribution helps us keep the Zoom call rolling and us offering the best that we can. So thank you all so much. As we are shifting, Jason, you want to give a little introduction to yourself and kind of a high level what we're looking at again today?
Sure. So I'm Jason Klimek. I'm tax attorney and cannabis attorney at OVA Gilman. Been doing this for like 3 years, I think, something like that. Working with New York. So today, as Zach said, I think we're finishing up Article 2, which is all of the kind of administrative stuff in the law. And then moving on to, I think, Article 3, which is all the medical marijuana law, which is also important, even if we're focused mostly on the adult use side. The medical stuff gives some context because the ROs, the registered organizations, can play a role in the adult use. So it's important to see some of the restrictions they have in medical and how that kind of translates over to the adult use side. So it's really good to have this holistic approach so that you really kind of understand the entire market landscape.
Great. And I see we got Mary Kruger, Executive Director of NORML. Mary, if you want to just say hello, give a little introduction.
Hey everyone, happy to be here. Zach said, I am Mary Kruger. I'm the Executive Director and founder of NORML. We are the Rochester chapter of the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. We're a cannabis consumer advocacy organization, so obvious overlap between the consumers and the industry, and yeah, gonna give some input on that today.
Lovely. Thank you for being here, Mary and Jason. And yeah, my name is Zach Sarkis, founder, executive director of New York HempLab, also founder of Flower City Collective. And we are super stoked to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up the document. If this is your first time following in with us, you're going to see we'll basically be reading line by line. We're working on our fast forward for any jargon that we've feels repetitive, but the idea is to break down this bill in a simple way. We're calling it a workshop because it's a way, there's a dialogue. If you're on the Zoom call, we'll be able to chat with you. So drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We're here for that. You may see something inspired by one of the things we say, and yeah, it's just gonna help the conversation go that much further. So as we said, we're picking up in the middle of section 2, or is it Article 2 technically?
Article 2. Yep.
Article 2, and I think here we are, paragraph 23. And so with the exception of promulgating the rules and regulations, the board, so we're talking about the board's responsibilities. Like, so the board that has a few appointees by the governor, a few appointees by the Senate and Assembly. And so we're talking about what their actual role is in creating the rules or implementing and enforcing. So the board shall have the power to delegate any functions, powers, and duties as provided for this in this section to the executive director of the Office of Cannabis Management. Any such delegation shall be through a resolution voted on and approved by board members. So simply put, the board will delegate any functions, powers, and duties. So the board is creating the roles and responsibilities of the executive director. And we've talked a lot about that position as one of a lot of power and a lot of decision making. So it's some kind of balance there between the board and the executive director. But we'll see exactly what that plays out to be. The board shall, 2 years after the first retail sale pursuant to this chapter, review the impact of license issues pursuant to the Article 4 of this chapter with substantial market share for any category or licensure to determine if such licensees are impairing the achievement of the goals of inclusion and social equity, licenses, fairness, and for small businesses and distressed farmers, adequate supplies of cannabis, and prevention of dominant marketplace participation in the cannabis industry. The board may modify the terms of the licensee's license consistent with the determination to better achieve those goals. So that's a big thing here. Any such modification may be appealed by the licensee for a formal hearing as provided in the section 17 of this article. And then it goes on to say that they won't be, any existing collective bargaining agreement shall not be infringed or voided by a licensee who after such review suffers from a reduction in market share. But this is saying, like, go ahead, Jason.
I think, it's a great thing to have right in the law that we will review to see if the law is meeting our policy goals. But it will also, I don't know if 2 years, I think there is a requirement to do it every so often thereafter, but I don't know how much data we're going to get in the first 2 years, because as we'll see when we move further down, social equity licenses are not transferable until after 3 years. So I'd be very interested to see when those licenses are now freely transferable, how does that further transform the market? And is the market still achieving those goals that, legalization was for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because obviously there's going to be multiple waves in this industry. There'll be, and with waves comes floods. And then of course, who's pushed out, the race to the bottom, et cetera. And like you said, especially with the social equity applicants and licenses, that there's this window that hopefully they'll continue to do such research, not just after the 2 year and it's the last time they do it, because there will be a huge market shakeup year 3 after licenses for social equity are shared. And then in many cases, merger and acquisition is a primary name of this game. And so we expect a lot of folks are going to be selling their businesses to get in and get out pretty quick. So we'll see market share, get more singular, I think, after such exchanges happen. And yeah, I'd be curious to see how it moves forward.
So is that saying that we could find ourselves in a situation where, for the next 2 years, the medical ROs are in the adult use space, and then it's evaluated and they come to find that the medical ROs having adult use licenses is infringing on the equity of the program and not really letting that happen, then those ROs could get their adult use licenses taken away?
I will put this in a way that I think that is theoretically possible. Let me stress theoretically.
Yes, the law is written where that could happen. Yeah.
Yes.
Yep, great questions. And I mean, we know that's a big thing that for folks who are interested about home grow, et cetera, like the sooner there's a adult use sale, the sooner folks can grow at home. But we also know first mover, first market advantage, especially when you got a bankroll, it's going to position entities much farther ahead than others. So on to the next step. So number 11, section 11, functions, powers, and duties of the executive director in the Office of Cannabis Management. The executive director, as authorized by and through this chapter, shall have the following functions, powers, and duties as provided for in this chapter. 1, to exercise the powers and perform the duties in relationship to the administration of the Office of Cannabis Management as are not specifically vested by this chapter in or delegated by the Cannabis Control Board. 2, to keep records in such form as they may prescribe of all registrations, licenses, permits issued and revoked within the state. Such records shall also so be kept as providing ready information as to the identity of all licensees, including the names, officers, directors of corporate licensees, and locations of all the premises. So essentially keeping data. And for any license or permit year, the term not to exceed, so exceeding 5 years. So it's a 5-year keeping data at least. 3, to inspect or provide for the inspection of any premise where medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, hemp cannabis are manufactured or sold. 4, to prescribe forms of application for licenses and permits under this chapter and all reports deemed necessary by the board. So all pretty standard stuff up to this point. 5, to inspect or provide for the inspection of any licensed or permitted premises where medical, adult use, or hemp is cultivated, processed, stored, distributed, or sold. I think that's an interesting one when going back to like home grow and medical home grow, et cetera. You know, if you are signing up to be a cultivator or a caretaker, does that open you up to inspection? All things just to consider. It sounds like anyone who's cultivating within the industry and in whatever way, shape, or form is open for inspection. Jason, do you have a thought there?
I mean, yeah, I don't think that applies to any kind of home grow or anything like that, because it's all talking about licensed or permitted, and from what I recall, there's no permit necessary for home grow.
I think that in the regulations, there's room for them to put requirements for permits for adult use for home grow. I think that there isn't anything allowing for that for medical. We'll get into that more when we get to the home grow section, but from my understanding so far is that we could see something in regulations come out that says if you want to home grow as adult use, then you have to have a license, you know, or register to get a permit with the state, probably more a permit than a license to be able to do that. So definitely something we're keeping a close eye on is NORML.
6, to prescribe forms of applications for registrations, license, permits under this chapter and of all reports deemed necessary by the board. 7, to delegate the powers provided in the section to such other officers or employees as may deemed appropriate by the executive director, to exercise the powers and perform the duties as delegated by the board in relation to the administration of the office as are necessary, including but not limited to budgetary and fiscal matters, to enter into contracts, memorandum of understanding and agreements to effectuate the policy and purpose of this chapter. 10, to advise and assist the board in carrying out any of its functions, powers, and duties. So this is saying that executive director will serve as an advisor, it sounds like, or part of and in partnership with the board. To coordinate across state agencies and departments in order to research and study any changes in cannabis use and the impact of cannabis use and the regulated cannabis industry may have on access to cannabis products, public health, and public safety. And 12, to issue guidance and industry advisories. So the functions are pretty broad and expansive, from you know, checking in on facilities or sites to determining what permitting looks like. And I think that broadness, you know, under the backdrop of some of the power structures we've discussed, yeah, again, leave a lot open to the executive director's choice. All right, number 12, the chief equity officer. Jason, you want to take this?
Sure. The board, by affirmative vote of at least 4 members, shall appoint a chief equity officer. The chief equity officer shall receive an annual salary. Okay, so here are the duties. The chief equity officer shall assist with the development and implementation of and ensure the Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management's continued compliance with the social and economic equity plan required to be developed pursuant to Article 4 of this chapter. The chief equity officer shall establish public education programming dedicated to providing communities that have been impacted by cannabis prohibition with information detailing the licensing process and information informing individuals of the support and resources that the office can provide to individuals and entities interested in participating in the activity license under this chapter. The chief equity officer shall provide a report to the board no later than January 1st, 2023, and annually thereafter of their activities in ensuring compliance with social and economic equity plan required to be developed pursuant to Article 4 of this chapter, and the board shall approve such report to the legislature. So very important position, another very powerful position that We want to make sure that the right type of person is appointed to that, because they are really in charge of kind of implementing the policy goals of the law.
Yeah, I'm curious what kind of teeth, such position will have, like from a checks and balance, like, okay, what if the executive director is pushing XYZ or the board is moving this direction and the chief equity officer is in opposition? And yeah, I'm curious. And it doesn't say explicitly, I'm sure we did cover this earlier, but looking at how someone can be removed from a position. And it's, the governor can remove someone from a position on, with, I can't remember the technical term that was used, but yeah, so what kind of support does the chief equity officer have? What kind of foundation are they sitting on from a job security perspective as well as implementation? And can they enforce specific things, or is it more of a a badged title? And hopefully it's more of an implementation and active action based position, but I'm curious to see how that goes. You want to keep going? Rulemaking authority?
Sure. The board shall perform such acts, prescribe such forms, and propose such rules, regulations, and orders may be deemed necessary or proper to fully effectuate the provisions. The board, in consultation with the executive director and chief equity officer, have the authority to promulgate any and all necessary rules governing basically the cannabis industry. Those include prescribing forms and application and establishing application, reinstatement, and renewal fees, the qualifications and selection criteria for registration, licensing, and permitting. Zach, can you scroll?
Yep, of course.
The books and records created and maintained by all registered organizations, licensees, permittees, including the reports to be made thereon to the office, methods of producing, processing, and packaging cannabis, medical cannabis, cannabis-infused products, conditions of sanitation and standards. I mean, if we really want to sum this up, they create the regulations. This is giving them the power to basically regulate the entire industry that deals with packaging and labeling, safety, further down the distribution and preventing, diversion into the illicit market and things like that. I mean, this is basically going through and saying that the board has all of these duties, and they will make rules and regulations that are designed to, take care of all of these different aspects. It's just showing how incredibly powerful that board will be. They will be the entity that is controlling legal cannabis in New York.
Totally. Yeah, and just again, high level, it's talking about the hearings procedures. It's not fully explicit yet. I'm curious what the regs will lay out. If there's going to be any additions to, is it going to break these outlines down any further? What does it look like to prevent the distribution of adult use cannabis or cannabis products? Is that going to be written out, or is it by their discretion? Obviously preventing cannabis sale from going to criminal enterprises and diversion. Leakage is a big thing in the industry. And we've actually been having this conversation, how do you shape the rules and regulations in a way that are going to be more inviting than pushing people out? And when we're talking, there's conversation about, establishing the supply chains under GMP certifications. And if we're talking about small businesses and small farms, small processors, that's pretty huge overhead, and isn't going to be a door at ground level, that's for sure. And so when we're looking at establishing protocols across the board, these are the folks that are making those decisions. Informing the public about the dangers of driving while impaired and consequences associated with the use of cannabis, prevent the growing of cannabis on public lands. And yeah, go ahead.
Don't possess on federal property.
Yeah, still
right
federally illegal. Yeah, right there. Prohibition and possession of the use of cannabis on federal property. And establish application, license, and permitting process which ensure all material owners and interest holders are disclosed, and the officials and other individuals with control over the approval of the applicant or permit or license do not themselves have any interest in the process. It's pretty standard, going back to no one in unless approved by the board, no one is allowed to have any financial interest in the cannabis industry, direct or indirect. The board. Yeah, and then of course, like one of the big questions that comes up again and again is about environmental standards, and the board, in consultation with the Department of Ag and Markets, as well as the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, shall promulgate necessary rules and regulations governing the safe production of cannabis, including environmental and energy standards and restrictions on the use of pesticides and best practices for water and energy conservation. I think this is just a huge one. You know, like you ask anyone, like the scientists and researchers, especially, you know, I heard this first at a conference in Canada when leading researchers in North America were presenting on the research being done in the cannabis industry, back to back, just saying like cannabis is the most energy intensive cultivation practice on the planet, indoor cultivation specifically. So how do we begin to transition towards a world where there are better practices, understanding that in New York State there will be indoor cultivation one way or the other, but how is it structured from water use, from energy use, et cetera? Those are all important things.
And I do believe when we get down into like the licensing for adult use, we'll start to see the legislature stating, you know, you have to disclose these types of energy plans and things like that. So at least they can start to look at and say, what do we think the impact is going to be if we start granting licenses to all of these companies?
Yep. Here's this interesting section we talked a little about last time about emergency rules and regulations. In adopting any emergency rule, the board shall comply with the provisions of subdivision 6 of section 202 of the State Administrative Procedure Act and subdivision yada yada yada. Such emergency rule may remain in effect for no longer than 120 days. And just to go back to it, it's, you know, if declared necessary, essentially all production within supply chain can be limited and stopped according to the language here. But here it's saying for no longer than 120 days. I think, you know, of course, having just experienced COVID and the shutdown last year, we now have a clear idea of what that actually can look like, where maybe previously we wouldn't have had such a clear context of what may require a shutdown. But we've also seen cannabis being considered an essential service, you know, in the same light. And that's where I'm curious to see what these languages, how it continues to specify. Just continuing on emergency rule, an emergency rule adopted pursuant to the subdivision or a substantially similar rule adopted on an emergency basis may remain in effect for no longer than 120 days, but upon the expiration of such 120 days period, no further readoptions or adoptions of substantially similar rules shall be permitted for a period of 120 days. So that's essentially saying that if there is an emergency rule, then there is a window of 120 days after that they can't re-implement the same like emergency state. How do you interpret that, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, that's how I read it, is that they basically can't keep these like things that are just rolling indefinitely that are trying to target the same thing under an emergency rule. They would actually have to like pass, you know, an actual law or regulation if appropriate.
And it's funny, this last one, this 6, it just seems like it was kind of stuck in here at the end. The board shall have the authority to promulgate regulations governing the appropriate use and licensure of the manufacturing of cannabinoids or other compounds contained within the cannabis plant through any other method other than planting, growing, cloning, harvesting, or other traditional means of plant agriculture. It's like we go through this emergency section and then they just like put that in there, which is just pretty funny. Okay, so the state Cannabis Advisory Board. Jason, you want to take this?
Sure. The State Cannabis Advisory Board or Advisory Board is established within the Office of Cannabis Management, directed to work in collaboration with Cannabis Control Board and the Executive Director to advise and issue recommendations on the use of medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, and cannabinoid hemp and hemp extract in the state of New York, and shall govern and administer the New York State Community Grants Reinvestment Fund pursuant to Section 99 KK of the State Finance Law. The State Cannabis Advisory Board shall consist of 13 voting appointed members, along with a representative from the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Department of Agriculture and Markets, the Office of Children and Family Services, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health, Division of Housing and Community Renewal, the Office of Addiction Services and Supports, and the Department of Education, serving as non-voting ex officio members. The governor
So
shall have.
that's like 8. So there's 13 voting members, then it seems to be 8 non-voting members. So like a board of 21 essentially.
Yep. And the governor shall have 7 appointments. The temporary president of the Senate and the Speaker of the Assembly shall each have 3 appointments to the board.
And so that's pretty reflective of the actual the board itself. Not this is the advisory board we're speaking of, but the actual control board is a similar ratio of how many folks the governor appoints, how many folks the Senate and Assembly appoint.
They'll serve 3-year terms. No compensation for their services. Let's see. The advisory board members shall have statewide geographic representation that is balanced and diverse in its composition.
So I just want to say, I think it's interesting that the board is not being given any compensation. You know, because if you're looking for folks to, the people who are going to sit on this board are going to control the Community Reinvestment Grant Fund. And the idea behind the Community Reinvestment Grant Fund is that more money is going to go back into communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And you would think the intent is to have people sitting on that board who have been directly disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, or at least have some representation from that community. And those folks usually are not in a position to be privileged enough to take time out of their paid work to do something for free to help develop a state program. So that's definitely something that, you know, the Start Smart Coalition has identified as being something that is somewhat problematic, and that, you know, the state is asking for folks to do this work without any compensation, which we all do all of this work without any compensation already in the advocacy and activism space. So interesting.
I appreciate that. And yeah, just getting to what Mary was saying, it's, you know, the advisory board shall have members statewide geographic representation that is a balanced and diverse in its composition, which is interesting because, you know, there's a lot of pockets in and out of across. Can you hear me? Did I lose you there? All right,
Got
cool.
you back.
Yeah, a lot of pockets across the state. And as we're looking at, like, you know, appointed members shall have expertise in public and behavioral health, substance use disorder treatment, effective rehabilitative treatment for adults and juveniles, homelessness and housing, economic development, environmental conservation, job training and placement, criminal justice, and drug policy. So they got a list of expectations. But then further, the advisory board shall include residents from communities most impacted by the cannabis prohibition, people with prior drug convictions, the formerly incarcerated, and representatives from the farming industry, cannabis industry, and other organizations serving communities impacted by past federal and state drug policies. So be curious to see, like, how much overlap, you know, if we, all the expectations that they required, is that 13 different, you know, individuals, or, you know, the public health, use disorder, rehabilitative, homelessness, economic development, you know, environmental conservation, job training, criminal justice, drug policy, and then, you know, farm, past convictions, formerly incarcerated. It's like the list, you know, it's going to be curious to see how they actually fulfill that list. I'm sure it's not like a make or break, but they have a pretty extensive list, a diverse list that they would like. And then how do you have that be geographically, you know, representative, or socially as well as geographically? The chairperson of the advisory board and the vice chairperson shall be elected from among the members of the advisory board by the members of such advisory board. And the vice chairperson shall represent the advisory board in the absence of the chairperson at all official advisory board functions. Advisory board shall make recommendations to the Cannabis Control Board, the office, and the legislature on cannabis and hemp cultivation processing, you know, the entire all components of the industry. The advisory board shall meet as frequently as its business may require. So back to Mary's comment, if there's a lot of business requirements, one, if they're meeting in person versus via Zoom, and trying to be diligent in recommending perspective to the board itself, it seems like it could be a pretty substantial workload, let's just say. The advisory board shall enact and from time to time may amend bylaws in relationship to its meetings and transactions of its meetings. A majority of the total number of voting members which the board would have where there are no vacancies shall constitute as a quorum, just for the internal business of the advisory board. So number 15, section 15, disposition of monies received for licenses fees. The board shall establish a scale of application, licensing, and renewal fees based upon the cost of enforcing this chapter and the size of the cannabis business being licensed. So they're looking at the fees for the cost of operations of the board, of operating the regulatory environment of the industry, as well as how big the business is going to be that is being licensed. I think that's an interesting note.
And this is one of the biggest questions is what will the applications cost? We don't know. We just have no idea how much any of the application fees will be. They haven't released any of that information. So it'll be interesting to see what types of fees they come up with. I suspect dispensaries would be lower cost, and large cultivation would be higher cost.
Yeah, agreed. The board shall charge. Actually, Jason, can you take this next section, starting at 1?
Yeah. The board shall charge each registered organization, licensee, and permittee a registration, licensure, or permit fee and renewal fee as applicable. The fees may vary depending on the nature and scope of the different registration, license, and permit activities. The total fees assessed pursuant to this chapter shall be set at an amount that will generate sufficient total revenue to, at a minimum, fully cover the total cost of administering this chapter. All registration and licensure fees shall be set on a scaled basis by the board, dependent on the size and capacity of the business. And for social and economic equity applicants, such fees may be assessed to accomplish the goals of this chapter. The board shall deposit all the fees collected in the New York State Cannabis Revenue Fund pursuant to Section 99(2) of the state finance law. Violations of the cannabis laws or regulations, penalties, and injunctions. Any person who violates, disobeys, or disregards any term or provision of this chapter or any lawful notice, order, or regulation pursuant thereto for which a civil or criminal penalty is not otherwise expressly prescribed by law shall be liable to the people of the state for a civil penalty not to exceed $5,000 for every such violation. The penalty provided in subdivision 1 of this section may be recovered by an action brought by the board in any court of competent jurisdiction. Such civil penalty may be released or compromised by the board before the matter has been referred to the Attorney General. And where such matter has been referred to the Attorney General, any such penalty may be released or compromised, and any action commenced to recover the same may be settled and discontinued by the Attorney General with the consent of the board. It shall be the duty of the Attorney General, upon the request of the board, to bring an action for an injunction against any person who violates, disobeys, or disregards any term or provision of this chapter or of any lawful notice, order, or regulation pursuant thereto. There's a whole formal hearing process. Looks like it's going to be you go through an administrative hearing first, which is typical for agencies. You kind of appeal through the agency before you can ever set foot in a court. So yeah, the board's, these are typical administrative agency things. The board's not bound by the laws of evidence. So otherwise potentially inadmissible evidence in court can still be considered by the board. That can cut both ways. Sometimes there's admissible or inadmissible evidence that helps the person. Sometimes it hurts the person. So, they want to try to be able to cover everything and not be bound by the rules of evidence, which can sometimes be archaic.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because because the board itself isn't operating as a courtroom, so they can bring whatever to the table, but just because they bring it to the table doesn't mean it would hold up if it went to court.
Yeah, So, I mean, there's as I said, the rules of evidence are archaic, and I am not a litigator, so my remembering evidence was back in law school over a decade ago. But like, there's some very weird, odd rules. Like, there's like the best evidence rule and things like that, where you have to have like the actual thing, and if not, then you can go down this list of what you can have, or hearsay. Hearsay is a very common one, where an out of court statement is made for the truth of the matter asserted, is I think the actual legal definition. But basically, like, you say in court what somebody said outside of court, unless there's an exception or exemption, what you're really supposed to do is bring that person into court and have them say it in court. Sometimes you can't do that. So like, this is saying like, we can kind of dispose of all of that, and we can at least listen to what would be considered hearsay. And then it's also important that it's the determination shall be founded upon a preponderance of the evidence to sustain it. So, preponderance of the evidence is like, if you had to put a percentage to it, it's like 51%, like more likely than not. So it's not, clear and convincing, which you could say is like 65%, or beyond reasonable doubt, which would be like 98%. So yeah, they're really kind of honing in on the fact that these are more informal hearings than an actual court case, but it is very typical for administrative hearings to kind of follow this track. If you do like a New York State human rights complaint and you get into the Human Rights Division in their hearing, it's a lot less formal than having to actually go to court. So it's, people who are used to dealing with this regulatory hearing process will probably feel very much at home with this, because it's very typical.
Cool, I appreciate that. So that means, where are we here? So notice in the right to a hearing, that's that part 3.
Yeah. So
go ahead.
Notice in a right to hearing is provided in the State Administrative Procedure Act shall be served at least 15 days prior to the date of the hearing, provided that whenever, because of danger to the public health, safety, or welfare, it appears prejudicial to the interests of the people of the state to delay the action for 15 days, the board may serve the respondent with an order requiring certain actions or cessation of certain activities immediately or within a specified period of less than 15 days. Service of notice or hearing or order shall be made by personal service or by registered certified mail, where service, whether by personal or mail, is made upon an incompetent partnership or corporation, shall be made upon the person or persons designated to receive the personal service by Article 3. That's almost the exact same, might be the exact same as the it is for courts, actual lawsuits. Say number 5, at a hearing, that to the greatest extent practical shall be reasonably near the respondent may appear personally, shall have the right of counsel, and may cross-examine witnesses against him or her and produce evidence and witnesses on his or her behalf. Following a hearing, the board may make appropriate determinations and issue a final order in accordance therewith. The board may adopt, amend, and repeal administrative rules and regulations governing the procedure to be followed with respect to the hearings, such rules to be consistent with the policy and purpose of this chapter and effective and fair enforcement of its provisions. The provisions of this section shall be applicable to all hearings held pursuant to this chapter, except where other provisions of this chapter applicable thereto are inconsistent therewith, in which event such other provisions shall apply. That's like the most lawyerly thing I've read in a while. Ethics, transparency, and accountability.
So this is the one that we've referred to again and again, that is like, long story short, no member of the board or office or any officer, deputy, assistant, inspector, or employee, or spouse or minor child of such member, officer, assistant, inspector, or the employee thereof shall have any interest, direct or indirect, either proprietary by means of loan, mortgage, lien, etc., on any aspect of the supply chain of the cannabis industry. We could read through each one of these things step by step, but it's almost not necessarily worth it. It's like literally the foundation of what they're saying is that you cannot have any relationship or vested interest in any business within the industry if you are in a regulatory position. Jason, you want to add anything else, or Mary?
It'll be interesting to see, because I don't remember or not, like if they carve out, what if you own, what if, let's say, Canopy Growth gets a New York license and you're a stockholder in Canopy Growth because it's part of your portfolio, and you're an insignificant stockholder. That means literally nothing to the corporation, but you technically own a share. That'll be interesting. It'd also be interesting to see how that relates to like licensing, as we talked about that in Article 4, because as of right now, you could totally make the argument that you wouldn't be able to own like a dispensary if like you own some Canopy Growth if they got a license to manufacture.
Totally. It's interesting too, this last like little section here. After notice and opportunity to be heard, anyone found to have knowingly violated any of the provisions of the section after notice shall be removed and shall divest themselves of such direct or indirect interest in addition to any other penalty provided by law. So if you happen to have known, like knowingly, had ownership in any part of the supply chain in the cannabis industry, not only are you going to get fired, but they're going to mandate that you divest from your interest from the existing like ownership or equity, et cetera, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I guess the non-compliance would go back to that first part where they said it's like a $5,000 fine, or up to. So.
Interesting. So you're saying the non-compliance as if like they didn't comply
if you didn't divest yourself, because that's what I'm thinking is like, you fired me. I'm not going to sell my stuff now, but then perhaps they can come back and say, well, we can fine you up to $5,000 if you don't. We have to see how that works in practice.
We've got a question in the chat here. I think those provisions derive from regulating liquor and alcohol. Interesting. Appreciate that.
As we go through this, it does become more and more apparent that they borrowed a lot from the SLA and ABC laws. You really start to see the similarity, even though, Mary can definitely attest to this throughout the whole process. When we were talking to legislators and things like that, we're like, it's hard to treat this like alcohol. They are very different substances. Yeah, at least structurally and administratively, that's pretty much exactly what they did.
All right, well, the next section of 19, Public Health and Education Campaign, the office in consultation with the commissioners of the Department of Health, Office of Addiction Services and Supports, and Office of Mental Health shall develop and implement a comprehensive public health monitoring, surveillance, and education campaign regarding the legalization of adult use cannabis and the impact of cannabis use on public health and safety. Public health and education campaign shall also include general education to the public about the cannabis law.
Which they did not do anything around when we created our medical marijuana program. They did everything they could to not inform and educate people about that program. So it'll be really interesting to see what this ends up looking like.
Then last part of this article, section 20, establish uniform policies and best practices. The office shall engage in activities with other states, territories, and jurisdictions in order to coordinate and establish uniform policies and best practices in cannabis regulation. These activities shall prioritize coordination with neighboring and regional states and may include, but not be limited to, establishing working groups related to laboratory testing, product safety, taxation, road safety, compliance, and adherence with federal policies which promote or facilitate cannabis research, commerce, or regulation, and any other issues identified by the executive director.
I think that's kind of funny, like work with regional groups on taxation when New York basically said, hey, hold my joint, I'm going to tax this the highest in the nation, when we have like Massachusetts sitting right next to us at a 20% tax rate. And it's like the easiest tax ever. It's like a flat 20%, you're done. So it's kind of funny there that they put that there, and then New York just kind of said, well, but we're going to do our own thing.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think, what do you guys think consensus wise here? feel like I'd like to open it up to just general Q&A and have some conversation with folks out there, whether about what we just talked about or not. We could start to dive into Article 3, but I think it's probably best to just save that. So do folks, Jason, Mary, you guys have anything you want to talk about in general, or anyone in the audience got any kind of questions? I'm happy to continue the rest of this 15 minutes in that fashion, just because it's easier just to section it off. And also, if no one's got any questions, we can call it a day and see each other next week. So open to whatever.
I'm happy to keep talking or not.
So Jennifer Burns asked a question. I guess I'm just concerned the state will make it so difficult. People are going to say, I'm not going to bother.
So I can actually talk directly to that point based on a conversation I literally just had. So I was talking to somebody who has historically, although they have promised that in the future they will not, operate in the illicit market. And essentially, as I was going through the whole rigmarole of legalization, taxes, reporting, compliance, blah, 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 I'm like, let me just tell you right now, there's literally no question that your prices will probably double, maybe even more, when you start throwing in all the legalities, the taxation, the pieces that you now have to pay for. It's hard. I mean, before, if you wanted to, sell cannabis illegally, you found a supply, you sold it. That was literally like the extent of the transaction. Now it's applications, it's taking a risk. You have to identify a piece of property on your license application that you can get within 30 days being granted the license. So there's all of these pieces. You need, realistically, you're going to need a lawyer. You're going to need an accountant. You're probably, depending on what side of the industry you're on, you might need consultants if you're like a manufacturer and need CGMP and things like that. It's a lot. And if you were used to operating in the unregulated market, I mean, your perspective is completely skewed. Like you were literally operating with no regulation. And now here's like some of the most onerous regulations that exist in the country, start doing it. So I do think that it's going to be very different. And, there are, I'm sure, people that are going to start the process and then just say, you know what, this is too overwhelming. I can't do this all, even though, as we saw earlier in the reading, that the chief equity officer is going to publicize all the assistance and help that OCM and the control board have. It's still just maybe overwhelming to a lot of people, and professionals will help, but at the end of the day, professionals still have to charge money, and if you don't have that, that's hard, because a lot of times organizations, companies pay us to deal with the headaches, so they're happy to write the check because they don't have to deal with it. If you're not in that situation where you can just write the check, it's now your headache.
Yeah, and again, for all the language around social equity and responsibility, et cetera, in the document, if the overhead entry point, if the entry point is with such high overhead, doesn't matter where in the supply chain, it's going to be, very challenging for folks to get involved. And I think that it's like there's innate contradiction within the structure, as well as the regulatory framework, where we want this to be something that's small business led, diversity within the ownership, within the workspace, et cetera. And as you said, it's like a lot of folks are going to run at it and hit this wall that they can't get over. That's just the cost of starting, let alone the fines. I've heard of like out in Colorado, for example, folks who had inventory issues with regards to their track and trace program. The fines are in the thousands, if not up like in the tens of thousands for if there's any compliance issues. So if you lay on like super high entry point, very complex regulatory and like compliance structure, and then high penalties for not being compliant, it's pretty damn impossible. On like when we're talking about it, I'm like, I don't know what that actually looks like going forward.
Yeah, and I think that is why, such a crucial part of this legislation was having, the funding for incubators in there to, it's not going to solve that problem, but it's going to help with that problem and giving folks a space that they can, have as a resource for some of those things that have a really high price tag on them and that sharing of it. And also the low and no interest loans, those being made available to folks for these businesses. Those have been those two items, the inaccessibility to the industry because of the regulations and the application process in itself. And then the other piece being just the money. How do you get the money to start the business when it's not like a traditional business that you can just go to a bank and get a loan? So that at least was thought about in this legislation, and we'll see as we make it through to the other pieces of the bill that there are things in there to try to address that. But I agree, it is going to be a continuing problem that we're going to have to be trying to solve.
And we talk about the waves, like the market's going to get flooded more than once. Like the ebb and flow is going to be very substantial, and how
You're on mute.
how that will impact the business's bottom line is pretty crazy. I do want to keep moving forward. We got some more questions. Jason, you want to take a quick swing at Brian's question? What do you consider the tax rate for New York State? 13% plus excise tax.
Yeah, basically, like when you calculate it out, it depends on the wholesale cost. But if you use like and we'll get into this more when we get into the taxation piece. But if you use like the wholesale cost of like the average from Massachusetts and Illinois is like the average wholesale cost that we'll probably see in New York. Flour, you're probably somewhere around a 30-ish% tax rate, and then edibles all the way up to like 50-ish%. And it's basically just looking at how much excise tax is paid, how much retail tax is paid, and then looking at that as a percentage of the price without any taxes. So, that's when I say we look at the whole tax picture, because it's not fair to say, oh, well, it's only 13%. No, it's not. There's excise taxes too. So it's important to include those, because those absolutely get passed down to the consumer and become an effective tax.
I love the questions that are coming in through here. So we got a few that are pretty darn connected. So I'm going to read them all at once. Will the penalties change? Jennifer asks, will the penalties change for those that are selling illicitly? Matt De La Porta asks, isn't this legalization bill essentially nothing but good news if you're in the illicit market and want to stay there? And then Richard Glazer says, isn't there a thriving underground market in many states that have legalized it? Can we figure a generous share will remain underground and served legally by home grow? Figure 50%. I think those are all really solid questions alluding to the same issue, and honestly the reality that a contradiction within this bill is that we have a very clear way for a formal market, as well as plenty of opportunities for personal cultivation, or what I'd say is not formal leakage. Again, leakage being like something that's supposed to be track and traced that then makes itself out of its traceability. It disappears into the illicit market, but more innate places where folks will be able to serve themselves. So we have the foundation for an industry, but then also a foundation for a plant that can be cultivated more readily and shared within communities. Gifting is legal. There will be home grow up to X amount of plants. And those are all things that kind of contradict the bill itself.
Do you know specifically if gifting's legal? Because I don't.
It is. There's language in there. I was just looking at it earlier this week. I'll send it. Let me see if I can pull it up while we're on here, because I was literally just looking at it.
Because I'm assuming that has to be. It can't be from licensed people. It's only unlicensed.
It's only unlicensed. Yeah, it's specifically for unlicensed. It's specifically related to home cultivation, and there cannot be any monetary, there can't be.
You can't hook it to buy this T-shirt from me and I'll give you some cannabis on the side.
It seems like that's not allowed for.
Because part of the thing is that as Zach was kind of saying, is there is this other channel where you can possess up to 3 ounces in public, 5 pounds at home. You can grow at home. What's the actual illegal behavior? The selling of unregulated cannabis. And really, you know, if you did that inside your home, that's where the illegal thing is happening. That's where law enforcement would have to catch you. It makes it very difficult to catch, because how do you prove, as soon as somebody walks out with cannabis that they are now legally able to possess in public, even though I think illicit cannabis is still technically illegal to possess if you knowingly buy it. But regardless, that's hard to catch. And with all of these disincentives in the legal market, the compliance, the taxes, this, that, and the other thing, it puts pressure on, you know, the legal market and the illicit market for growing. You know, we're going to see a very interesting, I think it's going to be very interesting to see the data when, you know, they try to estimate what the size of the illicit market is and the impacts of legalization on the illicit market. But let me just throw this out there really quick, because it's very easy to understand. Right now, you could go into a medical dispensary and buy 3.5 grams of cannabis, otherwise known as an eighth, for about $45. That's like, give or take, illicit market prices, a little higher, but it's in the ballpark. Let's say that. Those are multi-state operators with hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars behind them, in a fully vertically integrated chain, who basically have at least an oligopoly, you know, a few providers. How do you compete? Oh, and a 7% medical tax. When you're a small business, how do you compete? You're now in a 30-something% tax range. You're not vertically integrated. You don't have hundreds of millions of dollars of funding behind you. You don't have a 6-year runway that they had. You know, your eighths are not going to cost $45. They're going to cost $70 or $80. You know, that really hurts the legal market when you can go to the illicit market and get it much cheaper. Or even if you're inclined to buy it legally, you can go to the medical market if you have a qualifying condition, which, as we'll see, they opened it up to basically any condition certified by a doctor. You know, it puts pressure on the adult use market. I really think I think they got to retool it at some point in the future when we see the data.
Yeah, I firmly believe that we're going to see a restructuring 3 to 5 years out, where it's like, okay, they're opening the floodgates. There's going to be regs, and it's going to work in some ways, and it's going to stall and stutter in other ways, and that's like to be expected.
So I think it's important to recognize with this bill that the industry was always kind of a secondary motive behind it. The driving motive for legalizing marijuana for adult use in New York was to, you know, stop the criminal prosecutions and to stop, you know, mainly Black and brown folks from mostly low-income communities have been the ones who've been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. So law enforcement has continued to use this as a tool to frankly break communities down. And so our sponsors were really trying to use this bill as a way that communities could be built back up. And yes, one way in doing that is creating a mechanism for, you know, a regulated industry, and having equity tried to be built into that industry and supported in that industry, but it's so much larger than that. You know, we look at all of the tools that were taken away from law enforcement to continue to criminalize cannabis consumers, and they have very few tools left, you know, and so our sponsors know what they were doing in, you know, with how the illicit market isn't being wiped out with this bill. That was never the goal of this bill. And so it really puts it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next several years with our legalization program, because it does put pressure on the adult use market to, you know, do the right thing, because the illicit market is huge competition and is going to remain huge competition until they get it right.
I'll never forget, Mary, I don't know if you remember when we were testifying in Buffalo, and the Erie County DA was talking, and Crystal Stokes, he was saying, you know, we use smell as a pretext to search for illegal guns and things like that. And she looked right at him and goes, well, I bet you're, pretty much doing that in certain neighborhoods and not doing it outside, the Bills stadium. And so, I mean, clearly that got right to the heart. And at least, for one of the drafters of the bill, that was really an issue right there, as you were saying. So, I mean, yes, if you look at this purely in the context of we want to right the wrongs, we want to stop this discriminatory prosecution, then the bill is a success. Absolutely. No question in my mind that it will accomplish those goals. And, but the industry, I think, is another story that we're going to have to see how it plays out. But I think the legal industry has some hurdles to get over. I do.
Agreed. I just want to acknowledge there's a few questions that are left standing, and we have hit the hour marker, so we're going to log off here in a moment. There is the question about, is this going to be cash transaction predominantly, unless you're operating in crypto, but that's a whole nother world. And talking about, what are we allowed to do? Will I be able to host a cannabis infused dinner party at my private property with my friends? Can I open it up to paying consumers? There will be an on-site consumption license, et cetera. So those are all things that we'll see down the pipeline. And yeah, I want to give a big shout out to, again, for our friends Mary Kruger and Jason Klimek for both making the time to offer your perspective. I think this is really the best way that we know how to learn is through conversation, and that's the intention that we're trying to be here, show up with. Obviously, we're doing some reading through this document, but it's important that everyone sees it from the line by line perspective to really understand what's there. So seems like we got a lot more reading and conversation ahead of us. Big thank you to everyone who's out on the call. Big thanks to all of our members, individual members, sponsoring members, and business members. And yeah, we will see you all next week. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we appreciate y'all. So take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.